I wish to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Whadjuk Noongar people, pay my respect to owners past, present, and emerging. Unrelated, I've also tried to use my own footage and photos where possible, but if they ain't, you'll see a source in the top bottom right corner. G'day everyone. I'm here to discuss some statements on folk art and outside art, which is a subject near and dear to my heart. I've been real interested in this for the last 10 years and will be drawing on my own personal experiences from a trip I took around the southern states in 2019. But first off, what is outsider art? Outsider art is the English translation of art brut, coined by Jean Dubuffet in 1945 to categorize art made outside the fringes of mainstream culture. Often these artists were socially isolated, had no formal training, education, or money, and more often than not lived with mental illness or disability. Dubuffet claimed that because of their solitude and lack of access to art world influences, the works of outsiders were purer, more authentic, and more valuable than the work of professional artists. The works of outsider artists have had a huge influence on the mainstream art world. Jean Dubuffet himself, Grayson Perry, David Shrigley, just as a few, all make work that mirrors the aesthetics of outsider art. So what separates real outsider art from the false or the pastiche? It seems the only real qualifier is a supposed lack of self-awareness on the artist's behalf. A quote by Bill Traylor comes up a lot in outsider art texts. When asked what his paintings mean and why he does them, Traylor famously answered, "I just does them." This seems to be the blanket mission statement superimposed onto every outsider artist since, whether it's true or not. And so we see now this outsider label is largely problematic in that it kind of just works to reinforce a binary of who is considered normal or abnormal, who should be taken seriously and who should be seen as a charming or interesting spectacle. It's for this reason that many contemporary artists in this category prefer the less condescending labels of self-taught, visionary, or folk artists. Folk art was the label I encountered the most in the southern states. It's basically outsider art, but with a rural Americana tinge, and is more or less embraced... Shut up, bird. Is embraced by isolated southern artists with their dignity still intact. The southern states seems to have more of this sort of art than anywhere else in the world. One assumption may be that this is because of geographic and cultural isolation of many people in the Deep South during the 20th century. Dr. Everett James writes of the dominant belief that this isolation is where folk artists draw their power, that personal isolation ensures purity, and that our urban culture represents a virulent contamination adversely affecting the artist's purity. And although he is stating the common belief of other folk artists, historians, and collectors, Everett James supports these statements by adding that by celebrating the lack of outside influence, the uniqueness and creativity are contemporary folk art's most compelling features. So in other words, the more unaware the artist is of the art world, popular culture, and contemporary issues, the more original and therefore desirable their art will be. Therefore, the reason why outsider art and folk art look so unique is because they are so cut off from the rest of the world. Now, on the surface, I can appreciate this sentiment. There's something appealing about a childlike art practice free from the justifications, self-awareness, marketability, and cynicism of the contemporary art world. And seeing the folk artist's bizarre subject matter, unusual materials, and kind of consistent, abnormal internal logic, one might feel like these artists live in a completely different world. And more often than not, the artist's biography will support this idea of the outsider being wholly different to us, outside our world and outside of influence. But I don't think these statements hold up. The idea that anyone can make art outside of influence is overly romantic, condescending, and at the end of the day, impossible.
And that's a Coca-Cola bottle.
I don't believe anyone, especially in the 21st century, can make art outside of culture. Even the most socially, culturally, and geographically isolated artists still make art that responds to their environment and their cultural notions of morality, spirituality, and tradition. Yes, it might be a very strange interpretation of these influences, but by making art, they're still participating and responding to the events of the wider world. One example of this is the folk artist Clyde Jones, who I met on my trip. For the last 40 years, Jones created hundreds, maybe thousands of brightly coloured creatures with his chainsaw and lumps of wood. Now, these creatures don't seem to respond to anything or any issues in the wider world, and he also refuses to accept any money for them. So you might wonder, why on earth does he make these? When I knocked on his door and he called me in, I found him sitting in the middle of a completely empty shack, staring at an empty fireplace with nothing but empty 2-gallon water jugs around him. With this image, you sort of do imagine that pure, romanticized outsider, uncorrupted by money or art world fame, and producing work that responds to nothing at all but their pure impulse. On the surface, he embodies Bill Traylor's "I just does it" statement. But looking further, this is just not the case at all. At the front of every house in his neighborhood, you'll see several of his critters proudly displayed. His neighbors repay him in cooked meals and materials they find, and they wait to see what he'll do with them. And on this front, there's a clear motive and influence in his art making that is not commercial, but moral and communal. In an interview, he spoke that his main motive of making the critters is to gift them to children, hoping that they'll inspire the youth to create art instead of watching too much TV, which he sees as the world's source of moral decline. To me, this is responding to mainstream culture, so the idea that Clyde Jones is outside of anything is plain untrue. And I saw that every folk art environment was created in a public dialogue with the wider culture in some way, no matter how bizarre or confusing their means of communication is. Reverend Howard Finster, H.D. Dennis, and Floyd Banks were all preachers who built their castles to lure in curious young people, and they'd bail them up and educate them away from the path of corruption towards the path of God. Dr. Charles Smith, Sam Doyle, and Joe Minter all created their art sites as museums of their own African American histories. And if you visited them, they'd take you around and explain the history and stories behind every artwork. Joe Minter was home when I called in.
I got time for young folks, bro. Let nobody see you. I got time for young folks.
I'd learned that his work told histories of everything from slavery to civil rights to the moon landing to 9/11.
You don't go nowhere without taking history into account.
And what I found was that all folk art was created beyond these solipsistic reasons of "I just does it." They're all created in conversation with the wider world, whether it's globally or just their community. They exist in the world, not outside of it. You could even interrogate the accuracy of Bill Traylor's response, "I just does it." Even if he could not articulate his motive at the time for producing the thousands of paintings he made between the ages of 85 and 95, the paintings clearly depict his memories of growing up through slavery, as well as responses to the current events of the Jim Crow South. Painting on the street, he quickly gained public interest with people gifting him paints and materials and buying his works. So even the artist who supposedly embodies this, making art outside and apart from culture, shows this idea to be a clear myth. And there's a very mythic folk hero quality to the biographies of outsider artists. Whether in books, galleries, or verbal stories, folk art is always prefaced with an amusing biography of the artists, highlighting their isolation, handicaps, and eccentricities. Knowing the outlandish lives of the artists is seen as crucial to appreciating their art. The problem, though, is that these stories are often heavily exaggerated in a way that further accentuates the artist's otherness. Folk artist profiles are usually more urban legend than reality. Wallace Simpson, for instance, started creating his whirligigs after his daughter crushed her car in his driveway coming home from a bad acid trip. Simpson began to make and display these fluorescent windmills as a way of slowing down traffic. His daughter's car wreck stays at the front of his home as a warning to passing motorists. But in reality, his daughter is alive and well, and the car was just something he dragged home to make the house more interesting. Another one, Bucket Man, was said to die from inhaling too many plastic fumes from his melted down bucket sculptures.
Plastic, man, it gets so pliable and soft, and I love it.
But in reality, he died from an unrelated cancer. So what I'm getting at is that this image of outsiderness is partially manufactured by the wider public. It reinforces an icky way of engaging with the art as a spectacle rather than art as art in its own terms. And lastly, in the 21st century, with increasing levels of access to the internet, art tutorials, and cheaper tools, it's pretty hard to maintain this romantic idea of art made outside of influence. We might point to the deviant art of Chris Chan or Handia as examples of online outsider art in the modern era. Yet the idea of these artworks existing outside of culture and influence is totally false. So then what does the term outsider art function to do in this age other than reinforce binaries of normal and abnormal and good and so bad it's good? Tini Meekus writes that the term is problematic for artists, especially in support studios such as Dada or Art Project. Many artists in support studios want to be known as artists first and foremost. Their art to be considered as contemporary art, not folk art, not outsider art, not self-taught art or disabled art. The hope is that major galleries will begin displaying the work of non-neurotypical artists alongside the neurotypical ones, not separated and not mythicized. In conclusion, the terms outsider art and folk art have served as useful categories in bringing attention to marginalized voices, but the surrounding discourse has served to discredit and further otherize the very artists that it seeks to champion. The idea of these artists living and creating outside of culture, outside of influence, is completely untrue, and we ought to reassess the ways in which we look and engage with this kind of work. Thank you.